Hey, Dan.
Hi, Chris.
What are we looking at right now?
So today we are going to be covering some blueprinty stuff and how I would have done range mapping in Xpresso in Cinema 4D. How I use that to build out some of these gauge components to basically streamline my animating.
I love it. We're working on that trademark blueprinty. So anyway, I'm sure that's what they say in the biz, right? Don't forget before we get going, like and subscribe, hit that bell, uh, and help us
Yeah.
make more content. Keep the conversation going. Get it out there in front of anybody who doesn't know that they need to see this. Because I think that's what that does, right? Helps all the thingies.
It helps the things. It helps us keep making more of this stuff and helping all you MoGraph people push into Unreal if you want to.
Yes. Let's just dabble. Just keep playing on the side screen there, just at least. Also, check out Patreon link below. We're exploring that as well for more workflow, sharing project files, and other cool little thingies.
Thingies.
Since adding a Y to things is the theme for this one, Dan, take it away.
All right, thingy time. So you're going to look at this thingy. Uh, so this is still building off of the gauge design stuff. So a little backstory: worked on doing some 3D speedometer gauge stuff, um, some stuff that I want to deal with. But today, I want to show you how I kind of automated, basically onto one control, the growth of this whole thingy.
This makes
Uh,
oh, you're gonna make me laugh. I was gonna say this makes me happy though. On a serious note, this looks great. It makes me feel like I'm
uh,
on a movie set.
Yes, fun movie sets. I've got two of these things. This one's kind of keeping the light going, but I've got two gauge components. And for this one, ideally, I was trying to look at like a tachometer or any sort of growing gauge or anything like that. Turn this on. I'll just kind of show you a bit of how this is built. So I'm using some material emissiveness to cast some light, and I'm also using lights because lights tend to do a better job of casting light in Unreal. Makes sense if you think about it. But on this, I've made my own controls. I'm going to turn these off so we don't have to look at them anymore. But I wanted to make one slider because, as you can see, I've got 6 panels and then 6 lights. So that's 12 objects I would have to expose and keyframe per side. And then I want this one to be independent. So really, we're looking at 24 things we would have to keyframe. And I've got it down to 2 just with the way I've built these controls. So I set this at 1, everything's fully emissive, and I set this to 0, it's off. In Cinema 4D, I would have done this with using range mapper nodes, and I basically kind of spread it out. So as I scrub this value up, hopefully this is going to show up, it's just slowly illuminating each piece. So now I can kind of go up and down um, and all around and all the fun stuff. And I apologize if there's any lag. My computer is chugging a little bit. So let's dig into it. So I have this object in here. I've got this built into a blueprint. And I'm going to open this guy up and just kind of show you how it is. So this is the chunk that I've made. I modeled this out as several pieces in Cinema 4D. And I have a material basically set. So material 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 is each panel. So I'm using multiple materials to control this. And I've got multiple lights as well. So the main thing, and don't breathe into the brown bag yet because this is not as complicated as it looks. We are going to focus on the construction script. So we have in Blueprints the construction script and the event graph. The event graph runs in runtime. And if you're making game stuff and all that, the event graph is really going to be where most of your programming and stuff comes into play. The construction script is more useful for making tools. So when I want to, for instance, add on sliders and I want to play with look development in here, all of this is happening within the construction script. But when you go to render, so the movie render queue runs on runtime, so that switches into game mode. And the equivalent of this is hitting this play button. So if I hit this play button, we are now in game mode and we can fly around and we can play with our programming and do all the gamey stuff. But since I'm mostly using this for sequencer because I want high quality renders and I'm using this for design mockups and so on and so forth, I'm catering towards that. The caveat with this, especially for a design workflow and you're working with anything that's going to use Unreal, um, is that it's pretty easy to switch all this over. You could hand it off to a developer, and it's right there in the final stages. It's not like I'm mocking this up in After Effects or in Redshift and then handing off an MP4 to a developer and saying, "Hey, you need to build this now," and then they hate me. This is all kind of in the same ecosystem, which is to me very important, and for design people, they find it important too. But let's dig back into it. So that explains the construction script. This all happens in the editor. And all the changes you make in here, as soon as I hit play or we compile this to a game, it's all bakes in. And then you can't animate it anymore. You can't do anything with it. So these values that I want to animate, they don't leave the construction script. So I'll show you by the end of this the method that I figure out of kind of having these things work together so I can toggle this into final render and game mode, but also actually use this as a design tool and do look development inside the editor. All right, that rant's over. So the first thing I'm going to dig into is the light intensity. So I'm going to take a minute to kind of break down what you're seeing here. I have a bunch of variables that I have made. And variables are programming speak for just little objects that control things. That's my technical explanation. So on here, I have a lot of these variables made public. So we'll start with light gauge completion because that's probably the most important. So I've made this one. It's a float. A float is basically a decimal value. It goes from 0 to 1 and, whatever, infinite decimal amounts that you can scrub through versus an integer, which is a 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, but there's not that range in between. A float is also like a gradient. You have black and you have white, and then you have that smooth transition in between the two. So there's kind of a couple ways you can look at it. The first thing I did when I made this is expose to cinematics. Check this on because I want to be able to access this in Sequencer. And the other thing with these is this took me a while to find. But in class settings, if you want to animate in the construction script in Sequencer, you have to check on Run Construction Script in Sequencer. Otherwise, Sequencer is not going to animate in Sequencer. It's not an efficient way, and game engines are about being efficient, so that's what they do. And then also, I'm going to open Sequencer just so we can kind of see this as well. So I'll expose this again. So let's see, let's do left. We're going to open this up. So all the properties that I have. So light intensity, gauge completion. So we want gauge completion. So now if I set this to 0, we're at 0. And this is where some of this starts to work like sliders in After Effects or user data in Cinema 4D, which I personally love. So I have this set from 0 is off and 1 is completely on. If I crank it up past that, it doesn't matter. And if I go to negative numbers, it doesn't matter. It all just kind of stops there. So let's just set this to 0.5 so we're halfway there. So you can kind of see how I'm looking to animate this in Sequencer. So that allows me with those checkboxes checked to animate this in Sequencer. So let's dig into what's actually happening here. So we're going to focus on light 1. And all this is going to be duplicated, but I have gauge completion. So I have a float set for this. So just 0 to 1. That's how I'm mapping the range of this going. Light intensity is another one that I've got. So when I come back in here, I click this, I can crank these up, do 100. So I've got my lights and my emissive materials set to this. So I can kind of control this and just make my own tools to work. Light, color, emissive material, you'll see these are in there as well. I can control the color and change it. I can select the materials that I want, but this thing's kind of pre-built for how I wanted it to work for this. And let's dive through what this is. So we have the construction script. This is connected to the branch. I'm going to come back to the branch later, but you can see these chains. All of these need to be connected in order for this to work. As soon as I disconnect this, none of these events will be fired because we basically start from front or left to right and we fire through these. So if they're not connected, you basically just disable the entire thing. So I pulled in the node set intensity. So I've got my light in here. So I've pulled in my rectangular light. I'll look at this in blueprint view. This is the one I want. So this light, I have pulled in and accessed it. So I can do it this way. Just drag it in, drop it in, light 1. And then I pull this node, I right click, set intensity. And I think I just did it like this with it preset, but I pulled that node out. I'm telling this light that this is the one we want it to affect. And this is the big one. So the map range clamped. This is, to the best of my knowledge, the equivalent of the range mapper node in Cinema 4D. And what this does is I'm saying I have my light gauge completion variable. So this slider that's 0 to 1, my 0 to 100% of this whole animation is being plugged in here. And what I'm telling it to do is my in range is 0 and then 0.1666. So I did the math on these because I had 6. I divided it by 6 and I knew close enough that's the range that I wanted. So when this slider goes from 0 to 1, we're now telling it to go from 0 to 0.1666. And that's just going to control it on the first one. And you can see down here on the second one, we're going to pick up from where that left off, so on and so forth. So as I slide this slider up from 0 to 100%, this one is going 0 to 100%, 0 to 100%, all the way down, just one after another, because I'm clamping its range. And then in addition to this, set light color, because these are the tools that I wanted to have access to. I wanted to be able to change this light's color along with the material color in the script, and then go from there. So that's the first section of the light. I duplicated this for each light going down the list because I needed to set the light value and I needed to set the map range clamped range to stack one after another so that when I went to animate this thing, they would build up properly, because otherwise they'd either be all over the place or they'd animate on as one, and we don't want that. So that's the light. And it pretty much just did the exact same thing for the material, but I made this node. So create dynamic material instance. This just allows me to use the editor. So I wanted to have access to material here. So, if I made a bunch of these things, I could grab different materials and just plug it in. I don't have to deep dive into each material. This just allows me to access that one and control it. Platform's not being used, so I can delete that. And then the emissive material, so that's the source. Set vector parameter. I use this to control the emissive material color. So what this is I'm basically pulling a parameter from this material, which is the emissive color, and I'm just plugging in a variable so I have access to it outside of this menu and I can control it in the viewport, which to me is important so I can see what I'm doing. And then the last one is set scalar parameter. So the scalar parameter, which we covered in previous videos, is a 0 to 1 value. I made an emissive multiplier, so I called that out by name, so I can just crank up the intensity as I want. And I used another map range clamped node, like a range mapper, to duplicate this thing. So now I'm basically taking that material, like I did the light, and when my slider goes from 0 and in between 1.66, that's 0 to 100% for that one square. And then the next one is going to be the next set. So it's 0 to 1, 0 to 1, 0 to 1, and these just build off each other. And it seems a bit complicated, but it's very nice when you just want to animate and keyframe this one time versus 24 times like we initially talked about. And if there's any changes that come back over and over, if you're iterating on this like in a design process, you don't have to do it 24 times each time. And then the last thing from this, semi-complicated thing that you're looking at, create dynamic material instances. These I just set. So this is kind of a minute point, but I wanted to be able to change the base material for each step of this. So I link these all to the same thing. So now let's say if I wanted to make this to, let's pick this graffiti guy and plug this in. Now, as you can see, this just changes for each object. If I had 100 of these, I don't have to change it one by one. I can go through and just modify these as I see fit and then make any changes in the material. So that's the bulk setup. So the last thing that's the most important on this, and I'm going to actually come back and show you how this works in Sequencer, and then show you the big thing of how we go between the construction script and the event graph. So this actually comes out the movie render queue when you render it on the other side. So let's see. We're in sequencer down here. We have my light completion. And let's do this one as well. So gauge completion. Let's render this one up. So these are kicking out light onto the scene. And for kicks, let's do material color. I don't know why it gives me one option because it gives me everything in here, but let's see. Let's make this green because, I don't have a bunch of other ones to work with. We'll make it blinding. So if I wanted to make this weird, ugly, mellow yellow color, I could do that. But now I can control this in sequencer because these are the parameters that I've set in here. So you can see how these are reflected in here. But I'm making the parameters that I want to control. I think these are the things that matter, or this, the behavior that I need to change for this design. So that's what I'm accessing. So I've got these adjusted. So the last thing that's the most important. So say I want to go into Window, Cinematics, Movie Render Queue. So if I took this sequence, we're on this guy. Oh, come on now. So if I drag this down here and I hit render right now, the problem is because these are all using the construction script, which is in editor tools, none of these changes are going to translate. And that's a problem when you want to render, because when you hit render in the movie render queue, it's the equivalent of hitting this play button. So when I hit this play button, well, not as much change as I thought it would. We'll see what I broke. But that goes into runtime mode. So with these, what's important is I built in this final render mode. Okay, that's why. So if I hit render, none of these changes would go through. And what you're actually going to see is this final render. So when I hit final render for both of these are the default values that I built into this when I actually built this out. Everything uses green. It's got this weird matrix color. But this is what's built into the blueprint, and nothing is showing up. So the workaround that I slaved away and figured out was I used this branch node. So this branch is, for developers, it's a Boolean. It's not a Cinema 4D Boolean, but it's a true or false variable. And then I made this final renders that you can see here. So I made a variable, Boolean. I click this little eyeball so that it pops up out in my blueprint. But this is basically just going to be an on-off switch. I copy and pasted this whole thing into the event graph. It's just an exact duplicate. If you make a bunch of changes, you got to keep copy and pasting it. But when I check on final render to be true, I've got true mapping into this whole chain of events. Construction script by default is set to false. So when it's set to false, this chain of events runs in the construction script. Since they're the exact same thing, you don't notice much of a difference. But when you get out into this view, everything that I'm doing in sequencer in this viewport is actually just pulling from the construction script. So basically, by making that little switch and clicking final render to be true, all the animations you made, because we're using the exact same variables over and over, so final render, intensity, gauge, completion, this is being referenced in both sides. So we're only animating these. It runs on both sides. And this is a nice hack if you want to work this way and actually render these out as high quality frames. I don't know how long this took me to figure out, but a long time. But this has been a lifesaver if you want to do iterative and design workflow inside the editor, but you actually want to take the power of the offline movie render queue and push it forward. That was a lot.
I know this is a big one when you figured that out, because we were trying to do some stuff, and so
I spent so long trying to figure that out.
yeah.
It was in like the pits of hell of Reddit that I found a glimpse of it. So,
and there's nothing like building something and then like having it work finally. It's nothing greater.
Well, and I send this to render all the time, and I'd wonder why it just was always broken. Because the construction script, it's just not efficient. They didn't make this to be rendered like After Effects, which is how I'm using it, or like in Cinema 4D. it was made to be more of a design tool. It bakes all of your changes and then it kicks it out into runtime for game stuff. So this is definitely a hacky overview, but it does work.
Nice. Cool.
Woohoo.
Dan, I have to say, I think everyone that's watching will agree. Thanks for all your work. It saved us a lifetime of effort.
This helped me. I hope it helps you.
Yeah. Like I said, when you build something and it works, there's nothing greater than that. So thanks for sharing. Anybody has any comments or questions, drop them in the comments below. We highly encourage, even just thoughts. What do you think when you watch this? Just
What
to
do you
start
wanna see?
dialogue. We would love that. So yeah, until next time, I think that's it.